The summer sun burned hot over the small Texas town, its rays cutting across the open auction yard where dust rose with every shuffle of boots and hooves. It was the kind of place where cattle were brought in, horses were tested, and deals were made over a handshake and a spit in the dirt. But on that particular day, there was no cattle at the center of attention. Instead, there stood a woman taller than any man in the crowd, her wrists bound by thick chains, her dress hanging in tatters around her towering figure. Her name was Clara, and though she had once been the proud wife of a hard-working farmer, she now stood before strangers like a spectacle, a prize, or worse, an animal. The crowd murmured and laughed among themselves, not knowing what to make of her. Some called her a freak, others whispered that her strength could break a man in two. Yet, none of them looked at her as a human being. Clara's body trembled as she clutched at her stomach, swollen with child, her face pale as beads of sweat rolled down her temples. A dark stain of blood spread across the fabric at her thighs, and though her body cried out for rest, the auctioneer shouted as if nothing were wrong. "Step right up, gentlemen," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the hot air. "What you see before you is no ordinary woman. Stronger than any beast of burden, bigger than any man in this town, and carrying a child to boot. Who's willing to place the first bid?" The men chuckled, some shaking their heads, others muttering cruel jokes. To them, she was a curiosity, not someone to pity. Clara's heart pounded as she tried to remain standing, her mind racing back to the tragedies that had brought her here. Only months earlier, she had a husband, Daniel, who had been her rock, her only defender against the world that never welcomed her size or her difference. He was a farmer, gentle yet strong, who reminded her daily that she was not a monster but a woman worthy of love. They had dreamed of raising their child together, far away from the stares and whispers. But that dream had been ripped from her hands when Daniel died suddenly in a farm accident, leaving her vulnerable, grieving, and pregnant with no way to protect herself. The vultures of society came quickly after. Neighbors who once tolerated her turned cruel, mocking her behind her back, pushing her toward despair. Then came the day men appeared at her door, demanding she leave her home, claiming debts her husband had never owed. They dragged her away with chains and threats, telling her she would be sold off to whoever saw her as useful. And now, here she was, standing in the center of the auction yard, blood trickling down her leg, surrounded by men who saw only her size and not her suffering. "Do I hear $50? The auctioneer barked, slamming his hand on the wooden platform. "50 for this fine specimen of strength? 30? 20? The bids that followed were half-hearted, men laughing as they offered small amounts, more for entertainment than actual interest. Clara's vision blurred as pain surged through her belly, and she pressed her hand against her side, struggling to stay upright. She feared falling, feared showing weakness, because weakness in that place meant being discarded like worthless trash. Her child moved within her, a faint kick reminding her why she had to hold on, why she could not collapse before these men who wanted only to strip her of the last shred of dignity she had left. At the edge of the crowd, one man stood still, his hat low over his brow, his arms crossed as he listened to the cruel laughter. His name was Luke McGraw, a cowboy who had fought in the war and carried the weight of battles long over. He was no stranger to loss. He had buried his brothers on foreign soil and returned home to find his family's ranch nearly abandoned. For years he lived with silence, working the land with only his horse and the wide Texas plains for company. But when his gaze fell on Clara, something stirred deep inside him. He didn't see a spectacle. He didn't see a monster. He saw a woman fighting to stay on her feet, her spirit unbroken despite the chains and cruelty around her. When the auctioneer barked again, "Do I hear 20?" the bids faltered. The men had grown tired, their interest fading as they realized Clara was too much responsibility, too much trouble. Some muttered that she wouldn't survive childbirth, others scoffed that she'd be more of a burden than help. The auctioneer frowned, ready to dismiss her and move on, when a clear, steady voice broke through the noise. 100. The yard fell silent. Heads turned, eyes narrowing toward the man who had spoken. Luke stepped forward, his boots crunching in the dirt, his gaze locked on Clara. He repeated, louder this time, $100. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. Well, gentlemen, looks like we have ourselves a serious buyer. Going once, going twice. See us sold to the cowboy. The gavel struck, and the laughter returned, but this time tinged with disbelief. Some mocked Luke, whispering he was a fool to throw away that much money. Others muttered darker things, suggesting his interest wasn't noble. But Luke ignored them all as he walked up to the platform. He didn't hesitate as he climbed up and reached for the chains that bound Clara. Her knees gave way the moment the weight lifted from her wrists, and Luke caught her before she could fall. Her body felt heavy in his arms, yet he held her as though she weighed nothing. She stared at him, her eyes wide, confused, and desperate. Through cracked lips, she whispered, "Why a broken bar? Why would you buy me?" Luke tightened his grip, his voice low but steady. "Not to own you. To save you." Clara blinked back tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in front of the others. For the first time since Daniel's death, she felt something she thought she had lost forever: hope. Luke carried her down from the platform, his presence commanding enough that no man dared stand in his way. He placed her gently into the wagon he had brought, covering her with his coat, shielding her from the eyes that still lingered with curiosity and judgment. Clara winced as another wave of pain surged through her body, but she felt safer than she had in months, as though the stranger's arms had built a shield around her. As Luke guided the horses away from the auction yard, the voices behind them faded into the distance. The town would talk, that much was certain. They would whisper about the giant widow, about the bleeding woman bought at auction, about the cowboy foolish enough to pay $100 for her freedom. But Luke didn't care for whispers, and Clara, exhausted, finally allowed her eyes to close, trusting him in a way she hadn't trusted anyone since Daniel. The road stretched long before them, the horizon painted in hues of orange and red as the sun began to set. Luke glanced at Clara, her head resting against the wooden side of the wagon, her hand clutching her belly protectively even in her sleep. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. She was weak, and the child within her was at risk. But he had made a silent vow the moment he stepped forward at that auction, he would not let her die. And so, with the Texas plains wide and empty around them, Luke pressed onward toward his ranch, carrying not just a woman but a new purpose. He didn't yet know what fate had in store for them, but he knew this much: he had bought her freedom, and now he would fight to give her life back. The road to Luke's ranch was rough and stretched far into the plains, but he urged his horses on with care, mindful not to jostle the wagon more than necessary. Clara lay against the wooden side, her breathing shallow, her face pale under the setting sun. Every so often, she stirred, clutching at her stomach as though she feared her child might slip away if she let go. Luke glanced back at her again and again, each time feeling the weight of responsibility tighten in his chest. He had faced bullets in war, buried brothers in shallow graves, and walked through fire without flinching, but the sight of a bleeding, expectant widow in his wagon rattled him in ways he didn't understand. By the time he reached the ranch, night had fallen, and the crickets sang beneath the wide Texas sky. His ranch wasn't grand. Most of the old barns leaned tiredly against the wind, and the house itself had seen better days. But it was a place of safety, a place where no auctioneer's voice or mocking laughter could follow her. He pulled the wagon up to the porch and climbed down quickly. Without hesitation, he lifted Clara into his arms. She felt so heavy yet fragile, her head lolling against his shoulder, her body trembling with every step he took. Inside the house, Luke laid her gently on his bed, pulling blankets over her. She stirred, eyes flickering open, her lips parting in a whisper. "Why a broken bar? Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Luke sat beside her, his voice quiet, almost rough with honesty. "I don't need to know you to see what they were doing was wrong. You deserve better. Your child deserves better." For a moment, silence hung between them. Clara's tears welled and spilled, not of weakness but of exhaustion, of the burden she had carried alone for so long. Luke turned away, giving her space, but his mind raced. He knew she needed more than his promise, as she needed a doctor, and fast. Luke saddled his horse again and rode into town in the dead of night, pounding on the door of the only man he trusted, Dr. Samuel Grayson. The doctor, older now with hair gone white, had once patched Luke up after a near-fatal bullet wound during the war. When the door creaked open and Samuel peered out, Luke wasted no time. "She's bleeding bad, Sam. She's carrying a child. I don't know if she'll make it without you." The doctor hesitated only a moment before grabbing his bag. "Let's go." Back at the ranch, Clara tried to sit up but could barely manage more than a weak turn of her head. Fear gnawed at her, fear that she would not live to see her child's face. The memory of Daniel, her husband, filled her thoughts. His smile, his steady hands, the way he called her his Clara, his miracle. No matter what the townsfolk said, she clung to those memories now, whispering his name like a prayer. When Luke and Samuel entered, Clara looked up with glassy eyes. Samuel approached her with calm authority, setting his bag down. "You're in a bad way, ma'am, but we're going to do everything we can. I'll be honest, this won't be easy. But you're strong. I can see it in you. And that child of yours wants to live." Clara nodded weakly, her hand pressing harder against her belly. Luke sat at her side again, letting her grip his hand. Even in her weakness, her strength dwarfed his, but he held firm, giving her something steady to cling to. Through the long hours of the night, Samuel worked tirelessly, tending to her bleeding, calming her pains, guiding her through the grueling waves of labor that came sooner than expected. Clara cried out more than once, her voice echoing through the wooden house, but each time she wanted to give up, Luke leaned close, speaking to her in a low voice. "Stay with me, Clara. You've fought this long. You're not alone anymore." Her tears mingled with sweat, her face etched with determination. "Yeah, broken bar, I can't do this alone," she whispered. "You're not alone," Luke replied, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Hours passed like lifetimes. Then, just as dawn began to break, a new cry pierced the silence. Not Clara's, but the sharp, desperate wail of a newborn. Samuel lifted the child, small but strong, his tiny fists curled tightly. Clara collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as Samuel laid the baby in her arms. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The pain, the fear, the humiliation of the auction, all of it faded as Clara gazed down at her child. A son. His eyes shut tight, his cry fierce, his body warm against her chest. She kissed his forehead, her heart swelling with relief and love so powerful it hurt. Luke sat back, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He watched her cradle the baby, her massive hands careful and tender, her tears falling onto her son's soft skin. Something stirred deep inside Luke then, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. A quiet warmth, a sense of purpose beyond himself. Samuel clapped Luke's shoulder. "They'll make it. She's stronger than most men I've ever met. Keep her safe, McGraw." When the doctor left, the house fell into a quiet filled only by the baby's soft coos and Clara's gentle hum. She looked up at Luke, her voice trembling. "I thought I was going to die. I thought a broken bar I'd never hold him. But to a broken bar you gave me this chance." Luke shook his head. "You did this. You fought through every bit of it. I just gave you a place to do it." Clara studied him, her eyes searching his face for something unspoken. He was rough, weathered, scarred from battles she could only imagine, but his eyes were kind, steady, and full of something she hadn't seen directed at her since Daniela respect. The days that followed were a blur of recovery. Clara's strength returned slowly, though her body remained weak from blood loss. Luke worked the ranch in the mornings, feeding livestock and fixing fences, but every evening he sat with Clara and her son, helping in small ways. Sometimes he held the baby so she could rest. Other times, he simply sat near the fire, sharing stories of the war or listening to Clara speak of her husband, her past, her fears of raising a child alone. One night, as the wind howled outside, Clara whispered, "I thought no one would ever see me as anything but a burden again. They mocked me, hated me, called me a monster. Even when I was pregnant, they treated me like I was worth less than cattle." Her eyes filled with tears, but she forced herself to meet Luke's gaze. "But to a broken bar you saw me. Not what they said I was." Luke leaned forward, his voice steady. "You're not a monster, Clara. You're a mother. You're strong, and you're human. That's all I saw." The words struck something deep inside her, and she clutched her baby closer, her heart pounding. For the first time since Daniel's death, she felt truly alive again, as though maybe, just maybe, her life wasn't over. But the world outside the ranch had not forgotten her. Whispers spread quickly in town about the giant widow who had survived childbirth, about the cowboy who bought her not for labor, not for cruelty, but for a rescue. Some mocked Luke behind his back, calling him foolish. Others muttered darker rumors, jealous of his choice. But Luke didn't care for their talk. Every day he looked at Clara and her child, and he knew he had made the right decision. Weeks passed, and Clara grew stronger. She began helping on the ranch, her towering figure now an asset rather than a curse. She carried heavy loads with ease, tended to animals, and proved that her strength was matched only by her heart. The baby thrived, healthy and growing under her care. And through it all, Luke found himself drawn closer and closer to her, though he kept his feelings quiet, not wishing to burden her with expectations. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in gold, Clara approached Luke where he stood mending a fence. She held her child in one arm, her other hand resting nervously at her side. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Luke, a broken bar, you didn't just save me. You gave me a chance to live again. I don't know how to repay you." Luke set down his tools and met her gaze. "You don't need to repay me. Just keep living. That's enough." Clara's eyes filled with gratitude, but behind it was something more, something unspoken, something that neither of them dared to put into words yet. As the Texas sky turned to twilight, the three of them stood together, not as rescuer and rescued, not as widow and stranger, but as something new, something like a family. And though the road ahead would be hard, filled with whispers and judgment from a world that had never been kind, Clara knew she was no longer alone. Her son would grow up not in chains or shame, but in freedom, love, and dignity. And Luke, who had once believed his life ended with war and loss, had found his purpose again. Not in fighting battles, not in carrying burdens, but in saving a woman who had needed someone to see her for who she truly was.